Hello, my name is Quincy Harley Jr. and this afternoon I'd like to take you through an introduction to Excel pivot tables. So this on screen is an example of a database. To insert a pivot table, you need to identify what information you intend to display. Then select where you place it. It can either be placed on the same sheet the data sits on or on a separate sheet. Then choose which fields are going to appear in either the rows or the columns or both. And lastly, choose what data is going to be analyzed. And to give you an example of what the pivot table could look like, well, here's that pre-made pie I was talking about before. Here's my goal. What I want to do is to be able to identify in the rows the different regions, and also within the rows, we'll list the different products that are being sold as well. So the regions becomes the higher heading, and the products become the subheading. Then in the columns, we're going to display the market information, whether it's domestic or import. Then lastly, the value. What's the thing we're trying to analyze statistically? What are the numbers? So we're going to put the quantities of what's sold in the values area. Now this last thing here is a value added plus, filters and slicers. So we'll come back to that one after we first generate the pivot table. Switch back to our spreadsheet. And before we switch back, let's take a step backwards and remember, this is our goal. Regions as the major heading, products beneath it, and the markets in the columns. So that being our goal, the cursor just has to sit somewhere on the data that you're trying to pivot. It can't be sitting out in left field because that'll confuse Excel. And we don't have to highlight the entire pivot table, or sorry, the entire database, because you've already structured the database. It knows that it's a database. There's no blank rows to confuse it. So how to insert the pivot table? Any wild guess which tab on our ribbon might have the ability to insert a pivot? Oh yeah, it's that one. And that insert tab, any wild guess how to? Well, it's not that complicated. When I choose pivot table, Excel then basically asks a question that it kind of already knows the answers. It's already guessing the table range is all the data that was touching the cell my cursor was sitting on. It's even guessing that, like most people, I'd rather put the pivot table on a new worksheet rather than try to add too much data onto one worksheet. So when I press the OK button, it's going to be a little bit anticlimactic because it doesn't really make the pivot table. What it does do is create the separate sheet and then create all the different things that might become part of the pivot table. So here's where I get to lay out the pivot table. That's where the real strength of what a pivot table is comes from. I'm going to take the regions, as I mentioned before, place them in, I'm just going to drag this down to make this happen, place them in the row area. Now, watch the pivot table on the left to see what happens. It reads the data, and it puts a separate row label for every example of data it had in the database. In the columns, that's where I wanted to put the market data. And I was laying that information across. And because I wanted a more, I guess, detail-oriented pivot table, I wasn't going to just put just the regions in the rows, but I want to also put the product names in the rows as well. And since the region is the higher heading, we'll put the product names under region. Like so. And so far, the layout's perfect. The only thing missing is, show me the money, where's the actual numbers here? So we were going to put or I kind of decided for you that I wanted to have the quantities analyzed. That's the data that goes in the values area. And as I release, there's our pivot table. For every different product, it's already put the products in the different regions they belong in, and it's summarizing the values it had for that information. Pretty cool, huh? Now the reason why it's called a pivot table is because it allows the person who made the pivot table or the person viewing the pivot table to change their view of the same data. So for example, if I thought that having the details here was really too detail oriented, or let's reverse that. I don't really care which different regions they're in. I want each product analyzed. then I could move region completely out of the example. And this is now the same data you saw a moment ago, just without the subheading. Or I could swap the two. Instead of having product names down in the rows and markets, why not put the markets in the rows as the higher heading? Now I'll scroll down so you can see that now there's a spot for domestic and a spot for import. Or pivot altogether. I could put the product names across in columns. Now, given how many different products we have, I can't see why I might do this. But the key thing is, the person who's looking at the data can completely change the way they view the exact same data. Or by adding more fields to it, or more filters to it, they can even choose to see less data. So let me bring our pivot table back to what we first asked for, and that was to have the different regions and different products, and the markets to be part of the column breakdown. It's still summarizing the quantities. Before I introduce the filters, one more thing about pivot tables. Formatting them. If you point to the column heading and aim a little bit higher than that column heading, you see the mouse cue? It changes to a very small black down pointing arrow. When I click there, it selects all the similar headings. And now when I make my change, as you can see, it's changing all those headings. I'm going to go back to our clean database and change one of the values. In fact, let's go back and just arbitrarily grab this one, which is Ronbrau, fun to say. And instead of appearing in Europe, let's first of all increase the value. But also, let's change its location. Now, this makes sense, of course, but I'm just doing it to prove a point. I'm going to put this in Antarctica instead, because I'm pretty sure we don't have any place in Antarctica yet. Now, what I should expect to see happen is the pivot table should move that value of Ronbrau Klosterbier into Antarctica. Now, that gives me a chance to point out something very important about pivot tables. They don't refresh automatically. So Ronbrau Klosterbier is still showing up in Europe because until I tell Excel to update the pivot table, it doesn't. And that goes completely, I guess, in the opposite of what most people expect Excel to do, because we expect Excel to refresh automatically. Everything else you do in Excel, if you change one cell value, then anything that's dependent upon it changes automatically. No, Excel has exceptions, and pivot tables are one of them. So if I want to update my pivot table, well, as before, your cursor has to be on the pivot table, because if you're not on the pivot table, well, you don't get all these cool tools that just disappear at the top of my screen. When you're on the pivot table, you get pivot table tools. And on the Analyze tab, any wild guess which button I should be pressing to? Yeah, that's right, refresh. When I press the refresh button, that's when it refreshes the pivot table. If you blink, you missed it. Ronbrau moved out of Europe, and if I scroll, moved into Antarctica. And Antarctica came in blue because we told all our headings to be blue, now and future to be blue. So we've got our report, and I did mention how I want to also show an example of how you can filter in pivot tables. Another very cool tool is being able to analyze less than full data. Now on my screen here, I'm using actually a slicer to create my filter, which is a relatively new feature in Excel. It's an Excel 2010, Excel 2013 feature. Here on our pivot table, I'm going to go back to my pivot table tools, the Analyze tab, and insert a slicer. Which slicer? Because you can't have multiples. And that's where the real strength of the slicer feature trumps the filter feature. You can choose multiple slicers. I'm going to choose to add the category slicer and the market slicer. And it adds these controls to my screen, which stay on my screen. And they'll stay with the spreadsheet, which means that when someone else opens up this file, they have the same options. But I still have to point out, so what's the benefit of having the option, is now I can very easily just click and say, now show me this information, but only beverages. And that's all you're seeing. Show me the beverages, but only the ones that are import. Show me the beverages and the condiments that are import. Now I need to use an extra keystroke for this because you have to hold your control key to choose multiples on the slicers. But it becomes, again, just a very interactive tool this way. And I think that's where the greatest strength comes. It allows the person who generates the report the same strength and skills as the person who's reading the report. Well, that's it. That's everything about pivot tables that I wanted to share, at least initially. They actually can do a lot more than that. But I think once you've gotten your feet wet with pivot tables and get the familiarity with just how easy they are to work with, the advanced features will out themselves. I thank you for attending, for watching. If you have any questions, you can go to AskQ or to AskQuincy.wordpress.com to send me a quick note. Tell me if you like this. Thanks again.